Hey guys, I'm Sabrina and today we're going to make brined pork chops with apples and onions. Trust me, this is not the pork and applesauce you grew up with. I'll make sure to link the full recipe down below and let's just jump into it. For this recipe, I'm using center cut bone-in pork chops. These are about 3/4 of an inch thick, and on one side you'll see the bone. On the opposite side there's a little fat cap. I'm just making 2 portions of this recipe, but feel free to scale it up if you want to. The first step is to make the brine. I like to use apple cider in this brine because it complements the flavors of the apples in this dish. I add 1 cup of apple cider along with kosher salt and light brown sugar to a sauce pot, and I heat that up and stir it until everything's dissolved, and then I pour that into another bowl to cool down. To that, I add a cup of cold apple cider and cold water, and once the whole mixture is cool, it's ready to brine the pork chops. Next, I place my pork chops in a Tupperware container and cover them with the brine. If your pork's sticking up like mine is here, just make sure to give it a push down before you put it in the fridge. Ideally, the pork chops should brine overnight. The closer to 24 hours, the better. But if you only have 4 to 6 hours, that's totally fine. After the pork chops brine, we could prep the produce. I'm using a Vidalia onion here. I'm going to cut it in half. We could save that other half of the onion for another use. And then I cut off the top, along with a little bit of the root end, keeping it intact. And then you could give it a peel. And I like to slice it very thin for this recipe, about 1/8 of an inch thick. Next up, we have a Granny Smith apple. We also only need half of the apple. So once I cut the apple in half, I lie it flat and cut it in half again, and then I cut on an angle to remove the core. We're going to slice this apple nice and thin, just like the onions. About 30 to 60 minutes before you want to cook, take the pork chops out of the fridge and remove them from the brine. Next, I pat the pork chops dry and season them with salt and pepper. The longer they're in the brine, the less salt you need. But even if mine are in the brine for a full 24 hours, I still add a little salt. Next, I heat up a saute pan over medium-high heat and add in a little olive oil. I add in the pork chops and sear them for a few minutes on each side or until they're nice and brown. You can see mine got a little dark around the edges, and that's because of all of the sugar in the brine. Once they're browned on both sides, you could take them out of the pan and they won't be fully cooked at this point. Next, I lower the heat and add a little butter to the pan, followed by the onions. I season the onions with salt and give them a good stir and let them saute for about 10 minutes or so, or until they're nice and soft and translucent. And then I take those out of the pan and throw in the apples. I like to add a little brown sugar and salt to my apples, but if you're using a sweeter variety, you can probably leave out the sugar. I let these saute for a few minutes until they just start to soften, and then I add back in the onions and the pork chops. Next, I add in some low sodium chicken stock and a little apple cider, and I bring this to a boil and let it reduce down for a few minutes. And while that sauce is thickening up, the pork chops absorb all those tasty juices and become even better. About halfway through, I give the pork chops a flip and let them finish cooking on the opposite side. And I just give them a little poke to make sure they're done. I take those out of the pan and then we could finish up the sauce. I like to sneak a little taste to check for seasoning, and then I add in butter to round out the sauce. When you add the butter, make sure you stir constantly and emulsify it into the sauce. And now it's time to eat. Just spoon over some of that luscious sauce with all the yummy apples and onions over your pork chops and dig right in. This would be great served over mashed potatoes or creamy polenta with a nice acidic salad on the side. Yum! Doesn't that pork look perfect? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.